Ancient Persia wasn't just powerful, it was outright surreal. Behind the golden gates of the royal court, the king's shadow was sacred, rugs were dangerous, gifts were mandatory, and one wrong breath could end your career. Today, we're diving into 44 rules so bizarre, so extreme, and so wildly specific that they make regular royal etiquette look like amateur hour. 1. Government meetings were a chaotic mix of partying and policy because the Persians had a strict rule that every major decision had to be debated twice, once while sober and once while completely drunk. The idea was that if a plan sounded good when you were thinking clearly, and it still sounded like a fantastic idea when you were hammered on wine, then it must be a solid strategy. It is the only political system in history where "hold my beer" was actually a valid part of the legislative process. You can imagine the royal advisors waking up with a massive headache, trying to remember if they declared war on Greece or just ordered more pizza, effectively using a hangover as a final quality control check for running the empire. 2. Anger management was not a strong suit for the royals, especially when Xerxes decided to punish the ocean for breaking his bridge. When a storm destroyed his pontoon bridge across the Hellespont, he did not just rebuild it. He ordered his men to give the sea 300 lashes with a whip and throw shackles into the water. He literally sent people to yell at the waves and brand the water with hot irons to teach it a lesson about respect. It was the ultimate temper tantrum where a grown man tried to arrest the weather, proving that when you are the king of kings, nobody tells you that you look ridiculous fighting with a body of water. 3. Democracy was definitely not a thing, but apparently horses had the right to vote when it came to choosing a new king. When Darius rose to power, he and 6 other nobles agreed that whoever's horse neighed first at sunrise would get the throne. Darius's groom used a sneaky trick involving the scent of a mare to make his horse scream its head off at the right moment, literally rigging the election with pony perfume. It is absolutely wild to think that the ruler of the largest empire on earth was selected by a farm animal making a noise, proving that in ancient Persia, a horse had more political influence than the entire human population combined. 4. Say goodbye to normal handshakes because the Persian royal greeting was essentially a competitive sport in seeing who could eat the most dust without complaining. If you were lucky enough to meet the King of Kings, you did not just wave hello because that was way too easy for a living god. Instead, you had to perform a ridiculous ritual where you literally threw yourself flat on your face and kissed the ground in front of his boots. It was less of a greeting and more of a full-body workout, where the only goal was to look like a human rug. Imagine putting on your best expensive outfit just to belly flop onto a dirty floor because the guy in the golden chair needed an ego boost. 5. The fashion police in the Persian court enforced a rule that turned grown men into helpless statues whenever the king was in the room. When you stood in front of royalty, you were legally required to jam your hands all the way inside your extra long sleeves, effectively trapping your arms against your chest. You basically had to stand there looking like a penguin or a T-Rex, because the king was paranoid that anyone with free hands might try something sneaky. It is absolutely hilarious to picture the most powerful generals and advisors in the world wiggling around in their tunics, unable to even scratch a simple itch on their nose. It was the ancient equivalent of a straitjacket that you had to wear voluntarily just to prove you were a nice guy. 6. Dinner parties at the palace were the definition of awkward because the king treated eating lunch like a top-secret government operation. While everyone else was feasting in the main hall, the king would sit behind a heavy curtain or in a totally separate room because he refused to let anyone see him chew. Apparently, the idea of a god having to eat a sandwich ruined his mystical reputation, so he hid away like a shy teenager who did not want to sit at the cool table. It created this bizarre vibe where thousands of guests were partying with an invisible host, terrified that they might accidentally see him wipe his mouth. 7. Walking around the palace was actually a high-stakes game of the floor is lava, because stepping on the wrong rug was a massive crime. The king had these specific purple carpets that were dyed with super expensive saffron, and they were reserved exclusively for his royal feet and nobody else. If a servant or a clumsy advisor accidentally let their sandal touch the sacred wool, it was treated like a major disaster. You essentially had to hop around the throne room like a nervous kangaroo to avoid the fancy fabric, knowing that a single misstep would ruin your entire week. It is wild to think that a piece of decoration had more rights than the people working there. 8. Privacy was completely impossible because the king employed a creepy official whose actual job title was the King's Eye. This guy was not a metaphor. He was a real person whose entire career was based on being the biggest tattletale in history. He traveled around the empire, popping up at random moments to spy on governors and generals, acting like the ultimate hall monitor from hell. He would report absolutely everything back to the throne, so you could never relax or tell a joke because the professional snitch might be listening behind a plant. It turned the whole government into a nervous wreck, where everyone was looking over their shoulder. 9. Nature conservation went a little too far when King Xerxes literally fell in love with a random plane tree he found while marching to war. He thought this tree was so magnificent that he stopped his entire massive army just to decorate it with expensive gold jewelry and precious necklaces like it was his girlfriend. He even assigned one of his elite immortal guards to stay behind and protect the tree forever, which must have been the most boring and confusing military assignment in history. Imagine being a highly trained super soldier ready for battle, and then the boss tells you that your new mission is to babysit a plant because he thinks it looks cute. 10. Hydration was an absolute logistical nightmare because the king was the biggest hydro snob in the ancient world who refused to drink local water. The rule was that the King of Kings could only consume water from the Chosps River back home, no matter where he was on the planet. This meant that whenever the army went on a campaign, they had to haul hundreds of silver wagons filled with boiled river water halfway across the known world, just so the boss did not have to sip tap water like a regular person. It is hilarious to imagine the army struggling to carry supplies while the king is throwing a fit, because his special silver flagon is running low on his favorite vintage of H2O. 11. Wearing pants was actually a revolutionary and controversial statement that the Persians invented, confusing the heck out of the rest of the world. While the Greeks were running around in breezy tunics and skirts, the Persians rocked baggy trousers, which their enemies thought looked ridiculous and effeminate. It is funny that the toughest warriors in history were mocked for wearing practical leg coverings, but the Persians didn't care because they could ride horses without chafing their legs. They were basically the inventors of sweatpants, prioritizing comfort over the fashion standards of the Mediterranean, and looking incredibly cozy while conquering the known world. 12. Knocking on the door was not an option because entering the throne room without an invitation was literally a life or death gamble for everyone. The rule stated that if you walked into the king's presence unannounced and he did not extend his golden scepter to you, the guards were required to execute you immediately. It was the ultimate social anxiety nightmare where you had to stare at a golden stick to see if you were going to survive the meeting. Even the queen herself was not safe from this rule, meaning domestic disputes could turn fatal if she barged in while he was in a bad mood, turning every surprise visit into a high-stakes round of Russian roulette. 13. Gift-giving was a mandatory obsession because approaching the Persian king empty-handed was a crime that could get you banned from court forever. It did not matter if you were a wealthy governor or a peasant farmer. The rule was that nobody says hello without a present. This created a ridiculous scenario where poor people who bumped into the king would frantically scoop up handfuls of water or dirt just to offer him something on the spot. The king would accept these handfuls of mud with total seriousness because it validated his ego, turning every casual interaction into a weird surprise party where the gifts ranged from gold bars to literal clumps of soil. 14. Sunburns were apparently illegal for the monarch because he had a dedicated team of servants whose only job was to be human shields against the sun. Wherever the king walked, a parasol bearer had to follow him with laser-like precision to ensure that a single ray of sunshine never touched the royal skin. It was not just about comfort. It was a status symbol implying that the sun itself was not worthy to look upon the king directly. You can imagine the stress of the umbrella guy trying to keep up with the king's movements, knowing that if he let the ruler get a tan, he was probably going to lose his job and maybe his head. 15. Going hunting with the boss was the most stressful leisure activity ever because you were not allowed to actually hunt anything until he did first. The strict rule of the royal hunt was that the king had to throw the first spear or fire the first arrow, and jumping the gun was a massive insult. This meant that if a lion was charging straight at you, you technically had to wait for the king to notice and shoot it before you could defend yourself. It was a totally rigged game where the courtiers had to dodge wild animals while politely waiting for the monarch to take his sweet time aiming his bow. 16. Halitosis was apparently a matter of national security because servants were strictly forbidden from breathing anywhere near the king's dinner. The royal cupbearers and food handlers had to cover their mouths or hold their breath while serving, basically acting like human statues who were terrified of exhaling. It is hilarious to picture these poor guys turning blue in the face while holding a tray of roasted duck, just because the king was a germaphobe who thought peasant breath would contaminate his royal atmosphere. They essentially had to treat the king like a sterile lab experiment, ensuring that no common air molecules ever mixed with the royal oxygen supply. 17. Math was used as a psychological weapon with the elite unit known as the Immortals who tricked everyone into thinking they were zombies. The rule was that this unit must always have exactly 10,000 soldiers, and if one guy got sick or retired, he was immediately replaced by a backup from the waiting list. To an outsider, it looked like these guys never died, and just respawned like video game characters with a cheat code. The Persians basically invented the concept of an infinite glitch in the Matrix to scare their enemies, making people believe they were fighting a supernatural army that could not be depleted no matter how hard they tried. 18. Seat saving reached a lethal level, because sitting on the king's throne was a crime punishable by immediate execution. It did not matter if the king was out of town or if you were just really tired and did not notice the fancy chair. Placing your backside on the royal cushion was considered high treason. It was the most extreme version of calling shotgun in history, where the king acted like a possessive toddler who refused to share his favorite spot with anyone. You could be the most loyal subject in the world, but if you rested your legs on the wrong furniture, your life was officially cancelled. 19. Fashion. Copyright laws were incredibly strict because the king had a total monopoly on the color purple. Wearing a robe dyed with royal purple was not just a fashion faux pas, it was a direct challenge to the throne that could get you arrested. The king basically looked at a specific shade of the color wheel and decided that he owned it, forcing everyone else to dress in boring beige or brown. It is absurd to think that the police could knock on your door just because your scarf looked a little too fabulous, but the king was determined to be the only bright spot in the room. 20. Air conditioning did not exist yet, so the king forced his empire to invent the most expensive ice delivery service in history. He demanded fresh snow and ice to cool his drinks even in the middle of the scorching hot summer, which meant teams of runners had to sprint from the snowy mountaintops to the palace before the ice melted. It is wild to think about the logistical nightmare of hauling wet slush across a desert just so the boss could enjoy a cold smoothie. The amount of effort spent just to keep the royal lemonade chilly was probably enough to build a small city. 21. Landscaping was treated with the same seriousness as war because the Persian kings were absolutely obsessed with their gardens. The rule was that a king had to be a master gardener, and they would sometimes stop important military matters just to plant a nice tree or design a flower bed. It is funny to imagine a terrifying warlord taking a break from conquering nations to yell at a gardener about the placement of his rose bushes. They called these gardens paradise, and the king would personally get his hands dirty, proving that he cared more about his petunias than he did about some of his provinces. 22. Lying was technically the worst crime you could commit, because the entire Persian education system was based on riding horses, shooting arrows, and telling the truth. If you were caught telling a fib to the king, it was not just a small character flaw, it was seen as a betrayal against the cosmic order. You basically had to be brutally honest at all times, meaning you could not even politely compliment the king's haircut without risking your life if you thought you were faking it. It was a society where the concept of a white lie did not exist, making every conversation a high-stakes interrogation. 23. Cardio was apparently for peasants because the King of Kings almost never let his feet touch the actual ground outside the palace. He was always carried in a luxury litter or rode in a golden chariot, treating the earth like it was not good enough for his royal boots. It created this image that he was a floating deity who physically could not handle walking to the corner store like a normal person. The king was essentially the original user of a VIP taxi service, refusing to burn a single calorie on transportation while his servants lugged him around like a precious piece of luggage. 24. Bartending was the most powerful political job in the empire because the royal cupbearer was the only guy the king actually trusted. Since the king was terrified of poison, this guy had to taste every single drop of wine before the monarch took a sip, making him a human shield for the royal liver. This servant effectively controlled who got access to the king, meaning the guy pouring the booze had more influence than the generals commanding the armies. It is crazy to think that the path to power in ancient Persia involved becoming an expert sommelier and risking your life with every drink. 25. Toxic masculinity looked very different back then because the toughest Persian warriors were required to wear heavy makeup and wigs. It was a rule of court etiquette that noblemen had to spend hours getting ready, applying eyeliner and curling their fake hair before going out to do manly things like hunting lions. They looked like beauty pageant contestants while fighting wars, proving that in the Persian court, looking fabulous was just as important as being able to swing a sword. If you showed up to the battle without your face paint on, you were probably considered sloppy and unprofessional. 26. Taxes were weirdly specific because entire cities were assigned to pay for individual pieces of the queen's wardrobe. There were whole villages whose entire annual tax revenue was dedicated solely to buying the queen's veil, while another town worked all year just to pay for her shoes or her girdle. It is hilarious to think about a peasant asking his neighbor where he lived, and the guy replying that he was from the town of the queen's left sandal. It made the royal family feel impossibly large, as if their accessories were so expensive that they needed the GDP of a small nation just to get dressed in the morning. 27. Birthdays were the most important day of the year, and the only time the king would truly let loose with a menu that sounds like a dare. On the king's birthday, the royal chefs would prepare a feast that included an entire camel roasted whole, which is just an absurd amount of meat for any dinner party. It was the one day where the king gave out gifts instead of receiving them, and the sheer scale of the food was designed to prove that his party was better than yours. Guests would have to navigate around a giant cooked desert animal on the table, trying to act casual while eating a camel hump in honor of the monarch's special day. 28. The royal calendar was dictated by the thermostat because the king refused to be uncomfortable for even a single second of the year. The court was migratory, moving the entire capital city between Susa, Ecbatana, and Babylon, depending on the season to avoid the heat or the cold. They basically packed up the entire government, the treasury, and thousands of servants just so the king never had to sweat or shiver. It was the ultimate snowbird lifestyle where the administration of the empire had to pause and relocate hundreds of miles just because the king felt a draft, turning the government into a traveling circus that followed the nice weather. 29. Pet ownership reached insane levels of pampering, especially with a satrap named Tritontaecmes, who really loved his hunting dogs. He had so many dogs that he exempted 4 entire villages from paying taxes to the state, and instead ordered them to produce food exclusively for his puppies. Imagine being a farmer and realizing that your hard work is not going to feed the army or build roads, but to ensure a pack of dogs gets premium kibble. It shows that in the Persian hierarchy, a well-bred dog had a higher social standing and better catering service than the actual human beings working the fields. 30. The concept of the truth was taken so literally that the king's word was considered irrevocable law that could never be changed, even by him. Once the king signed a decree or gave an order, it was set in stone forever, which caused massive problems if he made a mistake or changed his mind later. It created a bureaucratic nightmare where they had to write new laws to loop around the old laws because they could not just admit the first one was a bad idea. It was like playing a game where you are never allowed to use the backspace key, forcing the government to come up with wild workarounds just to fix a typo in the royal policy. 31. Personal space was enforced by the terrifying axe-bearers who stood next to the king to ensure nobody got too friendly. These guards carried massive battle axes, and their only job was to chop anyone who threatened the king or invaded his bubble. It was a very clear visual reminder that, while the king might be smiling, there was a guy standing 2 feet away holding a giant weapon ready to turn you into firewood. It definitely killed the vibe of casual conversation when you had to stare at a sharp blade hovering near your neck, ensuring that everyone kept a respectful distance and laughed really hard at the king's jokes. 32. Fire safety was a spiritual obsession because the Persians carried a sacred fire with them wherever the king traveled. This was not just a lantern, but an eternal flame that was never allowed to go out, representing the divine protection of the empire. A team of priests had to guard this fire on a specialized chariot during military campaigns, ensuring it survived rain, wind, and bumpy roads. It is funny to imagine the stress of the guy in charge of the fire, knowing that if a sudden gust of wind blew out the candle, the entire army would think the gods had abandoned them and probably panic immediately. 33. Parenting was strictly regulated because Persian fathers were legally forbidden from seeing their own sons until the child turned 5 years old. The boy had to be raised entirely by the women in the harem, and the dad was essentially banned from his own nursery. The official reason was to spare the father from grief if the kid did not survive infancy. But it honestly sounds like a genius excuse to get out of changing diapers and dealing with crying toddlers. The king basically legislated his way out of the terrible twos, ensuring that he only met his male heir once the kid was old enough to walk, talk, and hold a miniature bow without drooling on the royal carpet. 34. The mailman was the scariest, efficient worker in the empire thanks to the invention of the angarium, a postal system that was faster than anything the world had ever seen. The Greek historian Herodotus famously wrote that neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night could stop these couriers, a phrase that the U.S. Postal Service eventually stole. These guys rode horses at breakneck speeds along the Royal Road, swapping mounts at stations like Formula One pit stops. It meant the king could send a text message across the continent in days rather than months, ensuring that nobody could hide from his orders just because they lived far away. 35. The royal dating scene was a logistical nightmare because the king had a harem that usually consisted of exactly 365 concubines. The idea was that he had a different woman for every single night of the year, which sounds exhausting and administratively impossible. Imagine being one of these ladies and realizing you have to wait a full calendar year for your next date night with the husband. It turned the royal bedroom into a rigid schedule where romance was dictated by a spreadsheet, ensuring that the king never had to sleep alone but also probably never remembered anyone's name. 36. Interior decorating on the battlefield was a must for the elite soldiers known as the immortals, who accessorized their weapons with jewelry. The bottom of their spears did not just have a normal spike. They had counterweights made of silver and gold shaped like pomegranates or apples. It implies that even in the middle of a war, the Persians wanted to make sure their equipment looked expensive and delicious. It is a hilarious flex to charge into combat holding a golden fruit, proving that for the king's bodyguards, killing the enemy was secondary to looking absolutely fabulous while doing it. 37. Dream interpretation was a mandatory government service because the king refused to trust his own brain without a professional consultant. The Magi were a priestly caste whose job was to tell the king what his weird nightmares meant, and they held massive sway over national policy. If the king dreamed about a grapevine growing out of his stomach, the Magi would decide if that meant he should invade Greece or just eat less cheese before bed. It turned national security into a game of psychological guessing, where the fate of millions rested on how a bearded priest interpreted the king's REM cycle. 38. The king's dinner table was essentially a public welfare program because he was expected to feed up to 15,000 people every single day. The royal kitchen did not just cook for the family, it provided rations for the bodyguards, the staff, and basically anyone hanging around the palace complex. It was less like a family dinner and more like running a military cafeteria, where the menu included hundreds of animals. The sheer noise of 15,000 people chewing on royal handouts must have been deafening, all while the king sat in his private curtained box pretending he was eating alone. 39. Souvenir collecting took a weird turn, because when the Persians demanded surrender, they specifically asked for earth and water. They did not want money or hostages immediately. They wanted a literal jar of dirt and a jug of water from your country to prove you belonged to them. It is such a petty and specific demand, forcing foreign kings to dig up their own backyard and ship the soil to Persia, just to say, "We give up." It was the ancient equivalent of forcing someone to give you their lunch money, but instead of cash, you made them hand over a handful of mud to humiliate them. 40. Gold dust was apparently the glitter of the ancient world because the kings were known to sprinkle it in their hair and beards for special occasions. It wasn't enough to wear a gold crown and gold jewelry. They had to literally look like a disco ball to ensure everyone knew they were rich. Imagine the nightmare of trying to wash gold flakes out of a curly beard at the end of the night. But it was worth it for the aesthetic. It sent a clear message that the king was so wealthy he could afford to treat precious metals like dandruff, turning his own head into the most expensive object in the room. 41. Bodily functions were strictly regulated because the Persian nobility considered themselves too perfect to act like human beings. Xenophon wrote that it was considered incredibly rude and shameful to spit or blow your nose in public while at court. The idea was that the elite were so physically superior and disciplined that they processed all their moisture internally, like a cactus in a fancy robe. Imagine having a terrible cold during a royal ceremony and having to just stand there sniffling silently because grabbing a tissue or clearing your throat would make you look like a weak peasant. It was a society where holding in a sneeze was a sign of high status, and letting it out could be seen as a total lack of self-control. 42. Toxic positivity was the law of the land because it was strictly forbidden to enter the king's gate while wearing sackcloth or looking visibly sad. The king's court was designated as a sadness-free zone, meaning you had to check your depression at the door and put on a happy face no matter what awful things were happening in your life. If you were mourning a relative or just having a bad day, you were effectively banned from work until you could pretend that everything was awesome. It was the ancient equivalent of a boss telling you to smile more, but with the threat of armed guards removing you if you brought down the vibe of the party. 43. Fake plants were the ultimate status symbol because the king kept a massive artificial plane tree made entirely of solid gold and jewels in his bedroom. This wasn't just a small decoration. It was a life-size sculpture with emeralds for leaves and clusters of gems for fruit, designed to show that the king was too rich for regular nature. While normal people had to deal with watering plants and sweeping up leaves, the king slept under a glittering metal tree that cost more than the entire army's salary. It is a hilarious level of excess where the monarch decided that real photosynthesis was boring and he preferred a garden that he could technically melt down and spend if he wanted to. 44. Personal space extended to the floor because there was a bizarre belief that stepping on the king's shadow was just as bad as stepping on the king himself. While this might sound like a playground game, it was treated with deadly seriousness in the royal presence, forcing courtiers to constantly watch where the light was coming from. You had to perform a constant dance to ensure your own shadow did not overlap with the monarch's, because touching his projection was seen as a violation of his divine aura. It effectively turned every sunny afternoon into a high-stress game of tag where the king was it, and everyone else was trying desperately not to get eliminated by a shadow. And that was life inside the Persian Royal Court. A world where etiquette could save you, sunlight could doom you, and even standing in the wrong place was a political statement. Now tell me this. If you had to follow one of these rules for a single day, which one would you absolutely refuse, no matter the consequences? Drop your answer below, because this comment section is about to become a battlefield of opinions. If you want more insane history every week, hit that like button and subscribe.